All right, so I think we're good to go here. So I was kind of working through some of the practice exam problems and just kind of mentioning some other things about the final today. So kind of like a review session. Just so I've got everyone here. Actually, I'll wait in case someone comes in late. Do it this at the class, but I think Monday afternoon. Obviously, I know you all have different schedules, and technically classes or kind of last day is Monday if you have Monday classes. But I want to try to find a time to do like an additional review session, or at least have a time available Monday afternoon when you can, you come in and ask questions specifically just this class. So I'll ask everybody who's here today, kind of the usual people who were here in person, kind of if there's a time that doesn't work, and see if we can figure something out. In addition to that, the final, still playing around with finalizing it, but it's going to have anywhere around 10 to 12 kind of multiple choice, and then 4 to 6, kind of depending on how I break things up, short answer questions. And those will be like those short answers. Some have multiple parts, which is what I'm kind of playing around with. Do I want to make this a separate question or separate example, or kind of try to build in more principles into one, having part A through D or something like that. So it'll look kind of similar to that midterm. We'll have 2 hours to take it. Our time slot, if I remember right, is Thursday at noon. Is that sounding correct? I see some hot heads nodding, so I just put everything on my schedule earlier today, and I keep mixing up some of my other classes. So let's just double check. I know it's here in the syllabus. Yeah, so Thursday at noon in person. And I'll try to get those graded relatively quickly Thursday afternoon and then Friday. So hopefully the grades will be up. Might take me a little bit into the weekend, but those should be up relatively quick. Should have my other classes done. As you're studying this final exam practice problem, the solution is a really good kind of set of questions to look at. Although your two other homeworks, you can kind of start looking at 3 and 4. That 5th assignment, which is due by the end of the day, Monday, I'll kind of upload an answer key to that as soon as that due date passes. So you'll have that to look at on Tuesday and Wednesday, some additional study material from that as well. And I'll have an answer key up for that. I'll move this final quiz kind of down here and drop the lowest like the syllabus states. So you should kind of have an idea about where you're at, assuming you do just as well in that 5th assignment as you have on kind of the first 4, or at least the average of those. Yeah, any questions for me before we kind of jump into like questions about the practice questions? Okay. So are there any questions that anybody had couldn't figure out the answer keys, answer how I got there, or any just kind of questions related to the exam content? Yeah. Okay, that's actually one of the ones I was going to work through. So I guess we'll start with that one, right? So you might see week a question that looks similar to this, and it could even be made into a short answer question. Right? So we've got both the player union and the teams here we're thinking about. I'm going to make this a little bit larger so it's easier to see. All right, and we've got an equation for labor demand and an equation for labor supply. Okay? So here, this is a little bit broad. I'll be a little more specific, actually. Let me write these down so I don't have to keep going back and forth. So we've got labor demand is, and labor supply follows this equation. So what we're thinking about is if we had kind of this labor market, and let's assume that the union, right, acts as an industrial union or acts as though they're a monopoly, right? And here I would give you the additional assumption on the exam that I was kind of assuming that we were thinking about this because we've looked at other similar models and homeworks, that the league or the teams have monopsony power, right? So we've got both kinds of power going on, monopoly, monopsony. So probably the easiest way to solve these, and we're going to come up with a range of possible values, is to figure out where that equilibrium wage the monopsonist would set or the teams would set, and then where would the monopolist or the union kind of set the wage. So we'll kind of go through both. So I've got my labor supply and my labor demand. Demand starting at 60, supply starting at 15. So if I've got monopoly power by the union, that kind of looks like our typical models where they're going to make a decision. I labeled these. I was talking and I wasn't thinking about what I was doing. Sorry about that. Right, I've got my supply of labor, right, going up and my demand going down. So I've got my marginal revenue curve, which is twice as steep as my demand curve. Okay. So my marginal revenue curve is going to be equal to 60, but twice as steep, so minus 4Q. So what the monopolist would do is set the equilibrium quantity where that marginal revenue is equal to that supply curve, which represents marginal costs. Okay. So what we need to first do is kind of find this quantity the union would set. Once we have that quantity, we would plug that into the demand curve to figure out, well, how much would teams be willing to pay that labor, right? And so this would be kind of the wage that the monopolist or the union would set. Okay. Well, I now have an equation for the supply curve, and I also have this equation for marginal revenue. I'm just going to set those equal to each other. Okay. So here's my marginal revenue curve. I'm going to set that equal to my supply curve. So once I do this, it's just a little bit of algebra. So I move some things around here. I've got what? 45 is equal to 6Q here. And then 45 over 6 is equal to Q. So that should be what? 7.5. Right. So just a little bit of algebra there. I've got my equilibrium quantity now, 7.5. I'm going to plug that value back into my demand curve to figure out what's the last wage that these teams would be willing to pay. Okay. So my demand curve is equal to 60 minus 2, plugging in that quantity of 7.5. Right. And I should get this equilibrium wage of 45. So that's going to be what, if we only had kind of this monopoly or this union power, that would be the wage that that monopolist could set, right? So if we're thinking about if the team has monopoly power or there's a union, that should be increasing wages. Right? And if the teams have monopsony power, they can get away with lower wages. So this should be kind of our upper bound. So if we're looking at kind of the answers here, C and A are the only ones that now make sense, right? Because we found that 45 would be that wage that the union or the monopolist would set. So now we have to figure out, well, we've also got monopsony power. We could draw this on the same graph, but it might be easier just to kind of do it separate, right? So move this over here for a second. Also, use a red marker because I think that this green one's starting to die on me. So we have the same kind of setup. Got our supply of labor, got our demand curve for labor. We have the points where they started, right? We've got our wage and our quantity of labor here. So what the monopsonist does is they're the only demander of labor, right? They're the only consumer. And so they're not concerned with revenues, they're concerned with expenditures, right? They're paying the players. And so they're going to face a twice as steep marginal expenditure curve, right? So if we had the supply curve before, just write it down from the other slide. My marginal expenditure is just going to start at the same point, but be twice as steep. Right? So I'm now going to set my marginal expenditure curve equal to my demand, which kind of represents marginal benefits curve. Or actually here, when you think about the demand for labor is actually the value of the marginal product of labor or the marginal number of wins. So I set those two equal to each other. So 15 plus 4Q is equal to my demand curve, which we had before was 60 minus 2Q. Okay, that just came from what we originally had written down. Now, once again, it's a little bit of algebra. So you get 6Q is equal to 45. Do a little bit of algebra. I end up with the same equilibrium quantity. All right, so this would be kind of the quantity of the monopsonist. And I know that players would be willing to supply their labor for whatever their marginal cost is or wherever we're at on the supply curve there. I know that this quantity, teams would pay as much as, wherever we're at in the demand curve, players would play for as little as wherever we're at in the supply curve. So I plug that 7.5 back into my supply curve, and the wage that the monopsonist could get away with is $30. So that's going to be my range of possible values. If I kind of overlaid these on the same graph, since the equilibrium quantity of both the monopolist and monopsonist was the same, we actually had this range of 45 to 30. Okay. So like I said, probably the easiest way to solve one as though there's monopsony power by the teams. Do a similar thing, but there's only monopoly or union power for the players. And then you'll have kind of your two kind of cutoffs for where that range equilibrium, the range for the equilibrium wage would be. Yeah.
Could you go over number 6?
Yeah, give me 1 second before I just make sure there's no more questions on this, right? So I've got one more thing I would kind of show you that you might have to do, right?
Monopsony right there.
Mm-hmm.
When they want the higher wage.
So think about the monopsony as the teams, right? So right, they're wanting to get away with paying lower wages, and they know players will play for lower wages, which is why they're setting the wage down there at 30. Is that? Yeah, remember the labor market, the demand, right, is coming from the teams. So if there's only one consumer, right, or only one league, right, that you can make deals with, that's what gives them that monopsony power. So they'll base their decisions based off this marginal, twice as steep marginal expenditure. Any other questions here? This problem. So one more thing you might expect to do, or you could do, and let's just assume we're only looking at if we have monopsony power. And we could do a similar thing if we only had the union having monopoly power, but we'll just look at it for the monopsonist here. I could ask you, what's deadweight loss here? Well, with this additional power, I know that without it, my equilibrium quantity would be out here. So my deadweight loss is the surplus, or the difference between the supply and demand curve, that I've lost out on by being at a lower quantity than the perfectly competitive quantity. Yep.
So you would have to set, if you're saying calculate it, value, you have to set the regular 15 plus 2Q equal to and subtract it.
Yeah, so in this one, right, I already found where the triangle kind of height starts and stops. The next thing I would need is, well, where does the base start and stop? Well, I've got where it kind of starts here. So I need to figure out what is this equilibrium quantity? Yep, you're correct. That's just setting supply equal to demand. So I'll just do my math here. Oops. Plus 2Q is equal to 60 minus 2Q. A little bit of algebra here. I've got 4Q equal to 45. Quantity would then be equal to what? 11 point, shouldn't be 11.5, right? Should be 11.2 maybe. 2.5. There we go. Yeah. Oops. You're all right. So I've now got the quantities. I can figure out the base of my triangle. I've got kind of the 2 points to determine the height of my triangle. So this would just be 45 minus 30 is the height. 11.25 minus 7.5 would be my base. And then it's a triangle, so multiply by half. That could be something else that I could ask you to do. Okay. So I don't know. I bring my calculator. 28. 0.125 here. Okay. Any questions on that? So you could do a similar thing with the monopoly power, right? By the union, you'd still be kind of looking for the surplus lost out on being at a lower quantity. Now it's just, we've got to find this point, which we already had 30, 45. We find the equilibrium quantity the same way. Both of them here in this situation, because of the equations that I chose, would actually result in the exact same deadweight loss. Okay. Oh. Any other questions on that one before we move on to the next problem? So you said you had a question on number 6?
Yeah. I chose A, but I don't understand how it possibly could be B.
Okay, so this is a good one. So suppose we've got 30 NHL teams, half discriminate against Canadian-born players, half of them aren't. Suppose a player whose value of their marginal productive labor is worth $10 million to every team, right? So we've got we're thinking of this one player. Suppose that they're Canadian-born. Which of the following would you expect to occur? So we're looking at the labor market for this one player, right? We can think about what this discrimination is going to do. And actually, let me make sure it's the teams that are discriminatory here, right? Yep, half the teams are discriminatory. So we've got 3 types of discrimination. We said employer and consumer discrimination, which operates similarly through that demand curve. And then employee discrimination, which occurs by shifting that supply curve. So we're dealing with employer discrimination. So that should be maybe a good thing to keep this straight. If I've got employer or consumer discrimination, that's going to be shifting my demand curve, right? If I've got employee, I should be thinking about shifts in my supply curve. So I've got supply of labor, got the demand curve for labor. And then I can think about, well, what happens, right? And I think I had the assumption, and usually I added in, that the supply is the same between Canadian and non-Canadian NHL players here. However, we know that teams are discriminatory, right? So it's almost like whatever the value of the player is, they feel like it's less because they incur this additional cost. So the value, the marginal wins coming from that labor, right? It's going to be whatever that value is minus some additional cost, right? And so we've got the demand from discriminatory teams, right? For a Canadian player is going to be lower, right? We see this kind of decrease in demand, and we would expect kind of the wages paid to that player from a discriminatory team to be less than that of a non-discriminatory team. So this is where we want to think about, we've got 15 teams who are discriminatory and 15 teams who aren't. So if a discriminatory team offers this Canadian-born player with lower wages, what's that player going to do? Well, if there's another team out there that's not discriminatory, right? Half are, half aren't. Well, that team would be willing to pay up to this wage. Right? So as long as we had 2 other teams, what's going to happen? Player goes to talk to one of those non-discriminatory teams. They offer him a wage just barely above what the discriminatory teams were. Right? And that's still good for them because they're still paying a wage that's much lower than the actual value of that player without discrimination. Remember, we're thinking about now he's talking to, it's like, maybe it's easier to think about he's on a discriminatory team and now he starts talking to 2 other non-discriminatory teams. So they offer him slightly higher than a wage than he was before. But then the second team says, well, yeah, we're actually okay paying you more because we offer you a slightly higher wage. It's still far below your actual value to the team. The other non-discriminatory team comes back. And basically, as long as you have 2 non-discriminatory teams, that for that player, his wage would get kind of bid up to whatever the equilibrium wage kind of should be. Okay. Now, if you only have 1, so there, we're thinking about his actual value is 10 million. So he should end up on a non-discriminatory team making exactly what his worth is, as long as we have at least 2 non-discriminatory teams. Here we've got 15, right? I split the league in half. But if there's only 1, what's going to happen? There's only 1 non-discriminatory team. they look at the player's current situation, and yeah, we would pay him up to this point, but we just barely offer him a wage higher. We know he'd rather be on our team, and we've now greatly underpaid for the value that we're getting from him. So if you only have one discriminatory team, what ends up happening? The wage is still higher than it was before, but it's going to be less than this equilibrium wage of $10 million. Okay. Now, that wasn't the situation, right? Because in the problem, it was 15 to 15. But if you only had one, it might be a good thing to know, then it would just be slightly higher than whatever they were earning before. Yeah.
And so when you said experience, you know, like what he would choose?
Yeah, like what would the long run result be? I guess if you want to think about it that way. Probably a better way to say that would, which of the following scenarios would we expect to happen? All right. Yeah. Any other specific questions? Huh? So the actual answer, right, because we had half and half, was that those teams would compete for that player, those non-discriminatory teams, bidding that wage all the way up to whatever his value was, which was told to be exactly $10 million. Yep. Yes. Yep. Could be. Right. It's probably a reason why I'm mentioning these things. At least knowing that difference, right, would be helpful. Any other specific questions on any of these that you want to see me kind of cover? Yeah.
Number 3.
Okay. Suppose, so we've got owner discrimination, so employer discrimination, but consumer and advertising agencies aren't. Explain using graphs in the labor market why top quality stars could still see close to equilibrium wages. Okay, so we didn't necessarily go over an example like this. This would probably be something more similar to what we did with the collegiate players at labor market, but we can work through it because I think it's, I'll make the connection there. So basically what we have is this consumer discrimination going on, but the consumers in that market don't, right? And so if we think about how could potentially top quality Black stars see close to equilibrium wages, but maybe low quality Black players would see lower wages than non-Black players of the same quality. So what we're getting at here is so we've got our supply of labor, got our demand curve for labor. We know that some teams are discriminatory. So kind of a similar setup to the last problem. I'm trying to think about lower demand curves. Right? So if these teams are discriminatory, then what we would expect is players of the same quality, right? So the demand curve for labor shouldn't be the same for either of them, but we then add in some discrimination. Players of the same quality will be earning lower wages than they should be, right? Or lower wages here. You know, we could think about this was the demand curve for Black players, and here we had kind of non-Black, right? In the sense that this was the group being discriminated against. However, if we're thinking about putting on the same graph low and high quality players, I think the question says, so close to equilibrium wages on low quality players. Okay, so for the higher quality players, right, all of this is going to be shifted up quite a bit, right? Because their demand curve for labor is influenced by the marginal wins they can add to the team, right? So we know higher quality players would have higher demand curves. Right? And I think about this as, call this demand for kind of high quality players. So even with discrimination, those equilibrium wages for the higher quality players could still be greater than that of these non-Black players, right? And the average non-Black player. So there I'm getting at the idea that you can combine discrimination with quality, and possibly if you have higher quality, even with discrimination, that group that was higher quality or those higher quality players could still be seeing wages that are kind of above what those non-discriminated against groups are of average quality. Now, if you're looking at both a white and Black high quality players that have the same quality, well, now it just goes back to that discrimination is just going to drive differences in those wages. But if we have a group that has higher quality, even with some discrimination, we could still see wages that are greater than the average of the non-discriminated group. Yeah.
Discrimination is scalable. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you're thinking about discrimination isn't a function of quality per se, right? Like, I don't care if you're a low or high quality player, if you're in the group that I discriminate against, the cost is the same. So the difference between these lines will always be this constant, right? This taste for discrimination. So for the higher quality players, that's going to matter less, right? Because it's going to be a smaller percentage of the overall. Yeah, for sure. So usually we think about it the way we've modeled it in this class. It's not a function of quality, right? It's just this constant taste for discrimination. I suppose you could say, if I had to guess, if I had like discrimination as my Y variable, and it was, a function of quality, I would probably think that this slope is negative. So for higher quality players, I maybe ignore my taste for discrimination a little bit more. And so maybe it does actually kind of close the gap a little bit there. It's not what I'm getting at necessarily with that question. I just kind of wanted you to think about what's going to be happening when we have this combination of employer discrimination, but also differences in quality between two players, two different groups, like Canadian versus non-Canadian NHL, or foreign domestic, I think was one that we used. But yeah, so you should be thinking about the combination of higher quality would push kind of our demand curve up, and then that discrimination is going to kind of decrease it for that group. And if you think about here, if I hadn't drawn that difference in quality near as much, so maybe if I'm thinking about, they're higher quality players, but they're not superstars, so maybe the demand curve was a little bit less, you can kind of imagine how this discrimination line could still fall below that of kind of the average non-Black player or non-discriminated against player here. So sometimes in these, and I'll indicate it on the exam if that's the situation, sometimes the size of that difference could matter, or the size of the discrimination could matter as well. And in those situations, I'll reference that, depict the scenario or explain for two situations, small differences or large differences. Any questions there? Any other specific problems that you want to see me work through? You got some general things that I'll mention. I think good things that would be good to know. All right. So I also have a set. As soon as I get the exam finalized, which I should be hopefully by the time I leave the office today, I'll put up a set of some other practice problems. I just want to make sure those aren't like a waste of your time, and that they're things that would be useful to go over in studying for the final. So I should be getting up another small set of questions there. You can have some additional stuff to look at. Yeah.
Do you want to go over number 2?
Yeah.
Short answer.
Oh yeah. Oh, short answer. Is this the short answer ones? Yeah. So we've got what? Assume that both male and female soccer players had identical revenues. Both are interested in players of identical quality or marginal wins coming from their labor. If the high quality female soccer player's salary was lower, what is one possible explanation other than gender discrimination that could explain this, right? So we've got, they're facing, identical. So they have the exact same revenue, and we're looking at the exact same quality player. The high quality female player was lower. What is one possible explanation other than gender discrimination? So I'm saying they have identical revenue. So despite having,
Is that the team having a good revenue?
yeah, so despite having identical revenues, right?
Are those the players or the team?
So you should be thinking about here, the teams kind of having identical revenues. So if we could still have the exact same revenue. What was I getting at here? Now I'm thinking about. Let me see what I put in the answer key, because I think what I wanted, I think I know what I was trying to get at here. Am I even saying the solutions here? So, yeah, for number two, I don't think I made this connection, and so I probably wouldn't ask you one quite like this. So I'll change it a little bit to show you something that might be a little more useful. So the idea being there that I can be at different points on my demand curve, earning the same revenue, but the marginal revenue is different, right? So it could be that total revenues are the same, but depending on the combination of price and quantity, right, I could actually have a different marginal revenue. And so it's still possible that when I'm thinking about my demand curve for labor, that the marginal revenue per win is going to be a little bit lower, right? And I think in that case, I had WNBA. So I would think about maybe a better question that would capture this is one thing that I might do on the exam is mention things that impact the revenue of a team. So I might say something like, assume that demand for NFL games has increased, right? For whatever reason. So maybe I say there's been an increase in income and NFL games are a normal good. So you know that in the product market, right, when we were thinking about the number of optimal wins, you should see, this kind of goes back almost before exam, we should see an increase in demand, which remember marginal revenue is based off of kind of that twice as steep demand curve. So we should expect that marginal revenue per win to also increase. So anything that increases the demand for the sport would also increase the marginal revenue per win, subsequently increasing the demand for labor, right? That makes sense. If the good that I'm making, I can sell for a higher price, I'm willing to pay my workers a little bit more to create that good. Well, what's the good here? NFL games, NFL apparel, all these other things that go into generating revenue for a team. And so if the team is generating more revenue, right, that marginal revenue per win increases, the demand curve for labor increases as well. The value of each player is a little bit higher. Right? The value of an NFL player in the 1950s is a lot different than what it is today, right? And that's because the demand for the sport has grown. So kind of thinking about there, anything that would change the marginal revenue per win or the demand curve in the product market, right? And when I say product, this could be all the other revenue streams. So ticket revenue, apparel revenue, anything. And generally, I'll be pretty nice about it and say something like, I might even just say the demand for the sport increases. Then we know that that's one of the components that is going to change the demand curve for labor, right? And then that marginal revenue per win being higher, we would expect, pretty simplistic in the labor market, if we've got the demand curve for labor increasing, we know we should expect to see wages going up, right? See if I can just a little bit more clear. Yeah, so number two, don't worry about the idea that total revenue could be the same and marginal revenues could be different. I'll kind of more to be specific about something that is going to be changing that marginal revenue per win. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah.
For gender discrimination, what form is that? Is that like?
So it could be, right, when we're talking about race, gender, nationality, all the discrimination will work the same, is in that it's going to be coming from one of those three areas, right? So I could have gender discrimination. I could have gender discrimination coming from consumers, Now, employer discrimination probably doesn't make as much sense when it comes to gender because we don't have mixed leagues, right? But if we ever did have mixed leagues and they were under like the same company, we could still have employer discrimination there. And there, that's really going to be, it operates in a slightly different way. So with the employer discrimination, we said it was almost like the value of the player minus this additional cost, this psychic cost from employing that person. So that was kind of decreasing our demand curve. With consumer discrimination, it's going to go back to impacting my marginal revenue per win, right? Because now if I have players that my consumers don't like, they're less likely to buy tickets, buy apparel. That has effects in the product market, which then kind of decrease the marginal revenue per win, which then decreases the demand curve. So it's shifting the demand curve in a similar direction. It's just operating slightly differently, right? Now with employee discrimination, right? This could be the people that you're playing with, right? Probably doesn't make sense in the sense of gender discrimination once again, because we don't have mixed leagues. So most of the gender discrimination examples you can think of, I probably give you like something either consumers or employers, right? Because employee doesn't really make a lot of sense unless we have mixed play. But for like other types of discrimination, right? You know, that definitely is a possibility. So we're thinking about employee discrimination. We're thinking about which way would the supply curve shift. So if I had go through these, actually, there should be one in here, so I can go over that one. I thought I would have had one, maybe not. Well, I guess we could work through one here. So I know there's one in the homework. So let's go through. Let's think about what employee discrimination would look like. So maybe this is something like, I've got my supply curve, my demand curve for labor. And we could think about this as maybe being, could do the NHL one where we're thinking about kind of Canadian born players, and let's say that non-Canadian born players, so NC and C, right? So the supply, we'll assume for a second, is exactly the same without the employee discrimination. Okay? And that the demand for both of, we're looking at someone of similar quality, so the demand curves are going to be the same for both, right? So they should both be getting paid, no matter your nationality, all right? If you're the same quality, we should be kind of seeing this equilibrium wage. However, let's assume that there's some employees, right, who are Canadian that discriminate against non-Canadian players on their team. What that does is, at every quantity of labor supplied, it's going to increase my cost. Remember, so this is kind of like my discriminatory employees. And we can kind of think about if my supply curve is representing marginal cost, it's really that now playing with people of this group I discriminate against, these non-Canadian born players, there's an additional cost to supplying that labor. It's whatever the old cost was, plus now I have to play with this, you know, these non-Canadians, and I don't like that, right? So the supply curve for employee discrimination is going to be shifting upward. It's not necessarily a shift in supply, but it's like the discriminating employees would only supply their labor at now these higher wages. And so now if if a team wants to get that same player, and we could even think about the thought experiment of at the exact same quantity of labor, they would have to pay that discriminatory employee a wage that is higher than a non-discriminatory employee, which would include two people, right? Canadians who aren't discriminatory, and then non-Canadians, I wouldn't assume they'd be discriminatory. Well, maybe it could be discriminatory towards yourself, right? Especially in the context of the non-Canadians, right? But this is kind of how employee discrimination operates, right? It pushes that supply curve back. And if we think about the equilibrium point, it would be that we would see any of the discriminatory employees would be getting a wage higher than their non-discriminatory counterparts. However, the equilibrium quantity would be lower. So we would see fewer of these discriminatory employees in the NHL, but the ones that remain might be able to command that slightly higher wage, right? And the idea there being, well, if I think about this as the aggregate, my demand curve, I'm basically like cutting my low quality discriminatory employees. Now, there will be a point where they're high enough quality, I'm willing to pay them this higher wage. So for the ones that keep their job, for your high quality discriminating employees, maybe it's actually a good thing, I guess. This is kind of weird, but it's actually like a good thing in the sense that there's others who are discriminatory as well, because these low quality, the people that were below you on the quality distribution, they're going to be the ones that get cut. Questions on that one before we keep moving? So you've got three types of discrimination. I would know how to, I would make sure I was comfortable with examples with all three of those, right? So I kind of gave you the outline, which one's shift demand, which one's shift supply. I would also think about combining that with, and we kind of already looked at an example like this, but another thing that would be good to know. So I'll say one, your three types of discrimination, kind of all those know how to, depict each one of those with a graph and kind of the subsequent effects that they have. I would then also think about things that will change the demand for labor, which we had two components. So here's the first thing that could change it. Differences in, maybe market size, right? That would cause the marginal win coming from marginal revenue per win to be different, right? Small versus large market. Anything that shifts the demand curve for the sport. Kind of already mentioned that, but primarily there, I'm kind of thinking about differences in market size. For the marginal wins, we're really thinking about this is low versus high quality, right? Those will be kind of the comparisons that we'll make there. Okay. So either one of these things changing could shift your demand curve. I would also think about making sure that you could think about combinations of those things. So maybe I've got small versus large market teams, and only one of them is discriminatory. That was kind of the question that you had in the homework. Maybe instead I do something like I've got high and low quality players and employees. There's some employee discrimination, right? So just kind of these different combinations of the three different types of discrimination, as well as kind of differences in quality or market size, which would kind of influence the two components of the demand curve for labor. Any questions up to this point? We got a couple more things I'll line up. And mainly what we focused on since the midterm really has been the labor market. So that will be kind of the bulk of what the questions are related to, both with discrimination, differences in quality, differences in market size. We also thought about supply of labor changes. So kind of similar to discrimination, and I really giving you a couple examples, but we were thinking about like city preference, right? Maybe this was the value of the degree, if we were looking at the collegiate labor market, right? Anything that would kind of make it a higher cost to attending one of those universities or a higher cost to belonging on one of those teams. Primarily like these, I will probably use an example from the collegiate kind of labor market if we were to open that up, because that probably makes the most sense to think about supply curve differences. But maybe like a good example would be at the professional level, LA versus all others, right? Or thinking about like a city that had opportunities for revenue outside of playing for the team, right? So LA, I heard something the other day, like LeBron James has doubled his net worth since he's moved to LA, just because of like investment opportunities that exist out there. The other thing that I would know how to go through and do is determining or thinking about the factors between offering a tuition remission. So we worked through a lot of these examples. There's a few of them on the homeworks, or offering wages, right? So this was the idea that, when we're thinking about differences across universities in terms of where their demand curve for labor would be at, where the player supply curves would be at, what types of schools would be more likely to have wages that would have a higher valuation than the tuition admission, right? So like I said, we worked through some examples in class. We had some of our homeworks. This is more often, we're thinking about differences in the size of the school. We're thinking about differences in the size of the popularity of the sport, Division I versus Division III, and that, universities, sports with higher demand curves for their labor would be more likely to have a wage that surpasses that tuition or admission value. Okay. And I'll do something for this in just a second. Another good thing to know how to do, and this will be helpful in the answer key for that 5th Excel assignment. So know how to think about what linear regression output is telling us. So I'm not necessarily going to give you output like from Excel, and then we're going to kind of really give a exact interpretation of the coefficients, but think more so about if you want to estimate the relationship between two variables, which one should be your dependent variable, which one should be your independent, right? So which one is causing the other? Think about what you would expect the sign of these coefficients to be. So for instance, if it was something like points scored and salary as a function of point, well, we would expect that coefficient to be positive. When players score a higher number of points, that should be correlated with that player being paid probably a higher salary. Right? I would also go back to the discussion that we had about kind of that hot hand fallacy, some of those papers that we looked at, and how when we're looking at the coefficient there on whatever previous success it was, right? If that's positive, that kind of tells us that people think that when there's previous successes, it's more likely that that continues. If that coefficient is negative, well, that was telling us that when there was previous success, people thought, well, this streak has to stop. And so we said that would be more so falling victim to the gambler's fallacy. And like I said, those 3 problems kind of on that 5th assignment should be, when I get the answer key up, that would be some good ones, I think, to review for the types of questions I could ask you related to that. Right? And hopefully just attending or watching the videos, we've talked through every week, at least one paper every week, right? So we should have had, a lot of experience just thinking about these coefficients are really telling us about the relationship between this X and Y variable. Another thing to think about would be, and it's a little bit broad, and it could be on several dimensions, but we're thinking about, the NCAA paying players, or we're thinking about maybe instituting, that'll be another good one. So I would think about, I'll just write it out first and I'll give you some. So you may see some questions that reference changes in competitive balance, right? So specifically, we could think about this primarily through this hypothetical, if colleges were allowed to start paying players, right? I shouldn't say it's necessarily hypothetical because they kind of are right now, that we should see changes in competitive balance as well from differences in the demand curve for different schools if we allow wages at the NCAA level, right? That's primarily kind of thinking about, if different conferences or different divisions were facing different rules about being able to offer wages or not, how might that influence competitive balance across the Power Five or between the Power Five and non-Power Five? But kind of going back to some of those examples where we thought about changes in competitive balance. I think one of the main ones, I think there was one in the, which number was it? So we had kind of number 4 here. So we had talked about when the NCAA pays for bowl games or pays for success, how might that impact competitive balance? So suppose that the NCAA allows all bowl games to be kept by the teams and not by the conference, right? So previously, that would, saying that now this is the change. Previously, the money was given to the conference and split equally with the teams, right? And similar to the NCAA tournament, they start guaranteeing spots for every conference winner, right, in these bowl games or in the top bowl games. What would you expect to have happen to competitive balance within the Power Five, within the non-Power Five, and then across the league as a whole? So what we're really thinking about there is we've got three things we want to identify, which was, so the example that kind of goes along with this one is within the Power Five, outside of the Power Five, and then across all conferences. Well, here we've got two changes, so we can think about how is each one of these going to impact competitive balance in every dimension. So the first one is teams are keeping the money and not sharing it with the conferences. So how is that going to impact within the Power Five competitive balance? Well, if the teams that are performing the best get to keep all of their bowl money instead of sharing it, what's going to happen between the best and the worst kind of team in that Power Five? I'm going to see that gap grow, right? So it's going to kind of make competitive balance worse, right? The low quality teams are no longer getting any of that shared revenue. And so we should see within the Power Five, this actually kind of decreases. We think about outside the Power Five, what would we expect to have happen? Well, similar idea, the teams that perform well keep all of the money, probably going to see a decrease in competitive balance there as well. And then across all of them, this one, if you gave me a good argument, I would argue it could be ambiguous. Now, more than likely, we think it's probably going to be that it decreases, right? Kind of similar to the effects of within, conferences. But the argument could be that if every team is keeping all of the money, what's going to happen to the best teams in these non-Power Five conferences? They're going to start to they're keeping all of the revenue. That gap is going to grow. They're going to start approaching the quality of some of these low quality Power Five teams. So now when you have the best teams in these non-Power Five conferences playing the lower quality teams in the Power Five, well, now they're more competitive matchups, right? They didn't have to share the money with the rest of the conference. They got better. And so there is going to be some possibility that we see an improvement in competitive balance in some games. We're thinking about overall, it's likely that this would win out. But if you gave me the explanation that the top quality teams in the non-Power Five can now compete with Power Five teams, that would be a justified answer for why it could also be increasing as well. If we then think about they give a guaranteed spot to every single conference, right? Well, how would that impact competitive balance within the Power Five? One's probably a little bit tricky. I probably wouldn't do this on the exam. But if the winner of the conference and of every Power Five conference now gets to go to a bowl game, what's happened from the scenario prior to that?
They're still getting paid if they win, right?
They're still getting paid. So I'm thinking about here was the first change, which was the teams keep all of their money. Now we're thinking about kind of the impacts of having this guaranteed spot. So what was probably true about the teams that win the Power Five before they made this change? They were going to bowls anyways. So it's probably that we don't actually see any change here, right? This effect probably wouldn't have any impact on within the Power Five competitive balance, just on its own. What about outside the Power Five? They are now guaranteed a spot, right? We would actually probably expect that we're going to see competitive balance increase because now those conferences are more likely to get money. The money's being, almost kind of given equally, right? Because we're thinking about just the effects of having that guarantee. And then across the league, well, now we're guaranteeing that some of these smaller conferences get teams in the bowl game, making sure they're getting more money. And so we would expect across competitive balance as well. So the combination of these things, we could really only say that the total effect would be that within Power Five competitive balance goes down. We can't really say outside, it could go up, could go down. And then here, once again, we kind of have things in opposite directions. And so I can't really say anything about cross league competitive balance here as well. So the only thing I can say for sure with the combination of these two effects is that within Power Five competitive balance will be going down. Now, on the exam, I likely wouldn't give you a question. This is a wink, wink, where you have two things that are changing. I would probably only give you kind of one of these. Okay. But that's a good one for thinking about kind of two different types of changes here. Okay. Yeah, anything on the homeworks are pretty much fair game. We kind of already talked about, just drawing monopsony power, just drawing kind of union or monopoly power. We've thought about differences in wages. Definitely know how to solve this model, right? Different numbers, but you'll probably see a question that looks very similar to this. Know how to do this number 4. Yeah, so the 7th thing that I would say is know how to do these contract zone examples. So we can work through this one here. So we've got the union and the league are bargaining over the number of preseason games. The league, wants more games, but they'd be willing to accept anything over 2. So this was kind of the league. And I'll try to color code this. The union won't accept any number above 4. I think I was being maybe not quite as realistic with this example, but here we go, right? So we're bargaining over the number of preseason games. So we know that the range of possible games is going to be somewhere between 2 and 4. Right? Those are the only ways an agreement is made, right, between the league and the players' union. So what would happen if we had optimistic or pessimistic beliefs? So what was the belief that is given here? So if the league is overly optimistic and believes the union will accept any number of games below 6, right? So I'll use a different color to draw in this optimism, right? So the league believes that not that the union would only accept something below 4, they believe that they would actually accept anything below 6. So what might be a negative consequence of this optimistic belief by the league? Well, if I think that the league would like to offer as many games as possible, and if I think the union will take anything below 6, well, maybe I'm not even going to be that bold, and I say, okay, I'll actually just propose 5 games here. Problem is, if they propose 5 games, the true threat point of the union is at 4, and the union would actually go on strike, right? So here, optimistic beliefs could lead the union to go on strike. What if we had instead the opposite? So let's say that the union believes that the league, and let's actually make this kind of a real crazy one. Let's say the union believes that the league will only accept a number of games 4 or higher, right? So this is kind of this black representing, this is the union's beliefs now about the league. Well, the union says, oh man, we won't accept anything higher than 4 games. We're only going to accept 4 games or lower. So if the union is proposing something here and they want to come to an agreement, what's the only value they can propose? Yeah, they have to propose 4. The league will definitely accept it. It's far above what their actual threat point is. So this pessimistic, I don't know how to spell pessimistic. I'm going to spell it wrong. So fill in the rest of it, right? So pessimistic, I'll give my attempt at it, but I'm sure that's wrong. I feel like there's only one C. Is it one C? Okay, there we go. I'm not an English major. So we've got these pessimistic views, right, have definitely led to the union proposing something that was too high. So essentially it cut into their surplus, right? So this pessimistic belief led to lower surplus for the union because they could have got away with offering 2 and the league might have accepted it, right? That would have been an acceptable value to the league. So pessimistic views are kind of like self-fulfilling prophecies, right? If I believe the other side isn't going to be willing to take anything below 4, I might propose an amount that's too high and actually cut into my own surplus. Whereas optimistic beliefs generally lead to me proposing something that won't be accepted, and the other side kind of either, if it's the union, they would strike. If the roles were reversed here and the union offered something too low, potentially the league could cause a lockout. Okay? So know how to kind of work through some of those contract zone examples, building in both optimistic and pessimistic beliefs. Once again, there might only be one P in optimistic. I don't know, who knows? I mean, a lot of people, but whatever. So that would be a good one to go through, or a good kind of question to know how to solve. And really, a lot of it's just gonna be different combinations of those different things that I've mentioned. Yeah.
So number 4 would be C though?
So it should have been that they proposed something too high and then the union strikes. So what was that? So we've got the league will propose a number of games that's too high. Yeah, so that would just be C. I didn't even add in the part about that we would see a strike occur, but that would also be a kind of a result. Oh, I know the one thing I did want to. So I said. One thing that might be good to know how to do, which is a combination of two things that we've actually already talked about today and throughout the class. But since you guys are here, we're running a little bit low on time. I think this is a good one to know how to do. So I may even do something. So like I said, we primarily talked about the labor market, monopoly, monopsonist power, some of the other issues. We then kind of progressed to thinking about discrimination being worked into that labor market. And then we kind of ended on more of this collegiate stuff, tuition remissions versus wages, differences that we would see in wages across different characteristics of the universities. So let's think about a combination. Okay? So I want to do my demand curve for labor and my supply curve for labor. Let's assume that I've got white and non-white players, and they have the exact same supply curve. I then have players of the same quality. And I'm thinking about maybe my non-white players are being discriminated against. So if I believe that's the case, and I think that it's being done through the employers, I'm thinking about for my non-white players, I might see lower wages. Okay. So this is where I'm going to combine possibly. So we've got wages of non-white players and then the wages of the group that's not being discriminated against, which is these white players. One thing I may do, and it's not that crazy, but let's say that I believe there's discrimination going on at certain universities, right? And then I allow there to be a free and open labor market. But I'm allowing schools to choose between offering their players wages, and this could, be different for any player. So they can decide to do tuition, wages, or a combination of the two. What players here would be more likely to be given the tuition remission? The group that's being discriminated against, right? So just like I talked about, there's usually we were looking at examples where there was differences in the demand curve for labor. Maybe it was the market size of the school, or maybe it was just the overall higher marginal revenue per win at the school. Or different sports, different divisions. We were generally thinking about that, shifting the demand curve, and then kind of saying, will that group's wage be above or below that tuition remission? I could also do a combination of discrimination with whether or not the wage would be over that tuition remission. And then if we have this free and open labor market, if there is discrimination, we could see different groups being treated differently. We could actually see certain groups that are being discriminated against be just given this tuition remission, because remember, what's the cost of the university? Nothing if, another good thing to know, two conditions are true. So what were those two conditions?
If they weren't planning to go.
Yep, so if they weren't going to attend university otherwise, right? And I say otherwise, unless they were given the scholarship, because if they were going to attend otherwise, when I gave them the tuition remission, I no longer am getting tuition from them. But if they weren't going to go to my school without the tuition remission, well, I'm not out anything, right? There's no opportunity cost there. What was the second thing that we need to be true? I didn't harp on this one as much. Yeah, right. I can't have a cap on enrollment, because if I have a cap on enrollment, by accepting this student athlete, I've pushed someone else out who would have been paying me tuition. So knowing those two might be a good thing to have going into that exam. Thinking about kind of working in discrimination into this idea of, well, for certain groups, would their equilibrium wage be above or below that tuition remission? might be a good thing to know. Okay. Let me think if there's anything else that I want to mention here. So I think we've got, let me just double check. So contract zones, changes to competitive balance, we talked about discrimination types, supply differences in the labor market, rational factors between tuition and admission. I think that should pretty much cover all the topics that I would make sure that I have a really good understanding of. Are there any other questions on any of these problems, or just like a more generalized question? Monday? Oh, yeah. I mean, before we get out of here, but just make sure there's no more questions on that you want to see me work through, or.
Just confirm, you said you were also gonna post another. So you got.
It'll be a small batch of questions that might be some good ones to be able to kind of look at. I just want to make sure that they're worth your time. And so I'm making sure that once I have the final completed, I'm not including questions on there that are just going to be a waste of your time. Yep. All right. So if you have any interest in meeting sometime Monday for last minute questions, actually, it could be one of 2 days. You could do Monday afternoon or Tuesday afternoon. Tuesday might be a little bit easier to find cohesion in all your schedules, but if you don't want to attend a review session either of those days, feel free to leave. But if you do, are there any times that don't work for people? That might be the easiest way to do it. Or would there be a preference for either day? Nobody has any preference? So Monday afternoon, do any of you guys have classes that would, what time?
The econometrics review session is Monday.
Okay, so that's helpful. So what about prior to 4? Are there any? 3:15? Okay. Let's do. What about Monday? Well, so we could do Monday from like 12, meet at like 12:30 or 1, and then go for like an hour, however long. Well, I know a lot of you are in econometrics though. So you've got a class that ends at 3:15. Let's start at 3, so you'll miss a little bit of it. But then for those of you who have the econometrics that you want to go to that, you could just go right to that at 4. I'll hang around a little bit later than 4, so that if you're here a little bit late or other people here a little bit late, we can kind of keep going over some stuff that maybe you missed at the beginning that I did with other people. Yeah, actually, this should be empty. 3. It's taken at 3. So let's meet. I can't remember the number. So on the first floor, I think it's 138. One of those 2 classes, those are both open at 3 o'clock. So you should be able to use one of those rooms. I believe it's when you come in the doors here, turn right. It's one of those 2 classrooms there on the first floor. I know those are open on Monday at 3 o'clock. So we'll kind of plan on that. Bring additional questions that you have, and I'll kind of hang around until we don't have any more questions. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I can record. I can just hit record once we kind of start that. So we'll plan on that Monday at 3. Like I said, I believe it's 138, but it's the room that's right there in the corner. Okay. Huh? Yeah, it's got the big glass. Someone paid for it. At Ball State Federal Credit Union on the wall. Yeah, that room. Any other questions? I will probably, so you can turn that project or homework in as late as Monday night. I'll probably start and I'll grade that 5th homework first, and then I'll start kind of chipping away at the projects. Some of those have been already turned in early. I may even start kind of going through a few of those here in the next couple of days. Other than that, and if you want to meet next week, so I'll do that review session, but if you want to meet Tuesday or Wednesday, I only have one exam and it's pretty early in the morning Wednesday. So my afternoons are pretty open. If you have some questions, last minute questions and want to stop by, just send me an email and I'll make sure that I'm in my office and meet with you at whatever time we come up with. Okay. Also, before you guys leave, I only ask you this once because I get emails all the time and I hate it. But if you don't mind filling out those evaluations, I would greatly appreciate it. Trying to get higher rates, it's always helps me kind of work on things, but it also helps out the business college. We have requirements to get a certain number of people to respond. So if you wouldn't mind doing that, I'd greatly appreciate it. That's the only time I'll mention it. They might send you some more emails. I can't do anything about that. Okay.
When is the deadline?
Monday at the end of the day. Yep. All right. All right. I will see some of you guys on Monday. And if not, I will see you Thursday at noon for the exam.